Okay, I think we'll get started. I want to welcome you to our opening reception and speakers for the speaker series for 2018-19 academic year. Thanks to all for coming. Students, graduate and undergraduate students, faculty, staff, administrators, and members of the larger Pittsburgh community. We really appreciate your support. CAUSE is now in its 23rd year, and some of you, thank you. And some of you have been with us from the beginning, and so that is really a record that I am happy to benefit from, and all of us at CAUSE are happy to benefit. I'm Joe Trotter, Giant Eagle. Well, I guess I should say Giant Eagle Professor of History and Social Justice, but also Director of the Center for African American Urban Studies and the Economy. So thank you. We have some special thanks that we have to send out to our President, Farnham Johannian, Interim Provost Lori Weingart, Dean Richard Shines, Department Head Donna Harsh. We want to thank you for all your support. And if Richard and Donna are here, would you please sort of wave? Oh, Donna is here. Okay, thank you. We also have been the recipient of extraordinary support from outside funders. And for the record, the very first grant that CAUSE received was from the Falk Fund. And the president of that organization at the time, Phil Hallen, is with us. And Phil, would you stand? That gave us energy. It got us started. But we also want to thank the Giant Eagle Corporation, Nancy and the late Milton Washington, BNY Mellon Program of Global Philanthropy, and Kenya Boswell is here. Kenya, would you just raise your hand? We've benefited from Kenya and the BNY Mellon people for a long time. But the good news is that we also have with us tonight, Jim, would you stand? Jim has been with, yes, he was the head of BNY Philanthropy at the time that we got our first grant from BNY Mellon, and so we really appreciate your help. Jim McDonald has been an amazing supporter even after he left Mellon or retired from Mellon. Our CAUSE Advisory Board, Eric Anderson, Etta Fields Black, Nico Slate, and also Kenya Boswell. We want to thank you for all your help. Program Coordinator, Hikari Day, would you please stand? Okay. And the most important person in my life is my wife. On a personal note, this is my sister and her husband, Mel Green. You know, the story is that when we were trying to find an acronym that would correctly sort of say who we were, CAUSE is Von Seal's creation. And so we appreciate that she creatively started to work with what we were doing and came up with that name. So thank you. Each year, CAUS hosts a postdoctoral research fellow. The CAUS fellow spends a year at Carnegie Mellon carrying out research on a major project on the African American experience. Last year, we were delighted to host Waverly Duck, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Pittsburgh. During his fellowship year, Waverly completed several scholarly essays and a new co-authored book, Interaction Orders of Race, How Tacit Interaction Racism Divides the Nation. And he is here today. Waverly, stand up, please. But now we're happy to report that our current postdoctoral fellow is on board, and his name is Dr. Andrew Pope. Andrew received his AM and PhD degrees from Harvard University, and he just completed his dissertation at Harvard, and the dissertation is titled Living in the Struggle, Black Power, Gay Liberation, and Women's Liberation Movements in Atlanta, 1964 to 1996. That's an amazing compression of diverse movements within diversity. And so we're happy to have him here. I want to say another word before having him stand. 14 days ago, the Journal of American History published his essay based upon his research, or part of his research. The essay is entitled Making Motherhood a Felony, African American Women's Welfare Rights Activism in New Orleans, and the End of Suitable Home Laws, 1959 to 1962. We have an amazing resource in Andrew Pope, and we'd like for him to stand so we can see who he is. Thank you. So now, without further delay, it is my immense pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Mary Frances Berry. Dr. Berry is the Geraldine R. Siegel Professor of American Social Thought and Professor of History and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. This is an exciting moment for me because Professor Berry has inspired my work and the work of my generation of historians for much, much longer than she probably realizes. I first met Dr. Berry when I was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. I didn't meet her in person. I met her through her unrelenting assault on racism in her first book, titled Black Resistance, White Law, A History of Constitutional Racism in America, published in 1971 and revised in 1994. That was an eye-opening book for me as a young scholar trying to find my way. She helped to revolutionize the way we think about the legal system and its relationship to the ongoing African American struggle for freedom, equal rights, and social justice. Moreover, her co-authored textbook with historian John Blassingame, titled Long Memory, The Black Experience in America, published in 1982, 2 years after I completed my PhD and took a job in academia. Long Memory, in many ways, was an early attempt to incorporate, but also move beyond the limitations of John Hope Franklin's very popular textbook, From Slavery to Freedom, published in 1947. While Franklin's Slavery to Freedom narrative animated the nonviolent direct action phase of the modern Black freedom movement. For my generation, long memory, breathed new life into the Black nationalist paradigm as a scholarly framework, while also reinforcing the Black power phase of the African American freedom struggle. It also suggested that we needed a fresh new history, a fresh new set of thoughts that helped us with the socioeconomic and political conditions that were beginning to emerge during the cresting of the modern Black freedom movement. But John Hope Franklin, despite this challenge, he no doubt embraced Mary and her upstart generation of young professional historians. And I have tangible evidence in hand that he embraced the work. Thanks to my postdoc and my friend, Waverly Duck, I am fortunate to have something that all of you would envy if you had. This is a precious gift from Waverly Duck. It is an inscribed copy of John Hope Franklin's Jefferson Lecture in the Humanities, given in 1976, and his Paul Anthony Brick Lectures at the University of Missouri, presented in 1992. Now I want to read something from this book. I mean, it even has this cover. I mean, it's amazing. I want to read you the inside. This edition of Racial Equality in America and the Color Line Legacy for the 21st Century is limited to 250 copies, signed by the author, of which this is number 121. John Hope Franklin's signature, right there. Amazing, amazing document. Okay? But I've got more to say about this. More to say. Got to make sure I keep my place in my notes, because this is important stuff. I don't want to get it wrong. Okay? In passing on this precious gem to me, Waverly wrote, and Waverly, I'm going to quote you. Waverly said, "I was fortunate enough to meet John Hope Franklin before he died. He was everything I had imagined him to be. Thoughtful, kind, giving, brilliant, and gracious." End of quote. That is exactly the experience that I had as a young historian trying to find my way into research on my first book, Black Milwaukee. John Hope Franklin opened his door to a young historian who had nothing to do, that he had not trained, that he didn't know, upon just a letter asking, "Would you talk to me?" And he did. But what is most remarkable about this book by the eminent John Hope Franklin, of all the historians of the American and African American experience, this dean of Black history dedicated this book first and foremost to Mary Frances Berry and her generation of young scholars and activists. In my mind, that trumps anything else I might have to say or anybody else has to say. But I do want to read just the brief note he put in here. And he said, "To Mary Frances Berry and to all of the others who believe in and work for racial equality in America." And that That's Mary. It is no wonder that Franklin dedicated this book to Professor Berry. She received her PhD in history from the University of Michigan and JD from the University of Michigan Law School. She is the author of 13 books. Since her college years, Mary Berry has been one of the most visible activists in the cause of civil rights, gender equality, and social justice in our nation. As a commissioner and then the chairperson of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, Berry demanded equal rights and liberties for all Americans during 4 presidential administrations. In 2013, she was one of the recipients of the Nelson Mandela Award from the South African government for her role in organizing the Free South African movement, which helped to end the apartheid system. She was also selected to speak by the South African government at the national celebration of the life, legacy, and values of Nelson Mandela in Washington at the National Cathedral in December 2013. Berry was the 1991 president of the Organization of American Historians. She is a distinguished fellow of the American Society for Legal History and a fellow of the Society of American Historians. Her publications include such subjects as the history of constitutional racism in America, child care, and women's rights. The book, Power in Words, The Stories Behind Barack Obama's Speeches from the State House to the White House, offers insight and historical context for President Obama's most memorable speeches. Another of her books, $5 and a Pork Chop Sandwich, Vote Buying and the Corruption of Democracy, explains that some campaign voter turnout activities, aggressive activities, are just another form of voter suppression. Today, she will talk to us about her most recent book, History Teaches Us to Resist. This book describes in detail how activists launched and advanced equal rights, justice movements in what she described as often reactionary times. So, no more to be said. Let us welcome Dr. Mary Frances Berry.
Thank you so very much. Joe took up all the time, so all I'm going to say is, Estrada, I don't know if you can ever make him stop talking, but all I'm going to say is hello and goodbye, because Joe took up all the time. He told me that I could not take up too much time. And I didn't know that he was going to, don't say, I did that once at a university where when I got up to speak at the commencement to accept an honorary degree, I wasn't the commencement speaker, but I was getting a degree. They didn't dare have me speak. But anyway, when I was going to the podium, the woman said to me, "Don't take too long." So when I got up, I said, "Hello, thank you," and I'm not taking too long, and sat down. Anyway, and the audience howled. Let me just say that I did not know that Joe was going to talk about John Hope, Franklin. And so I must tell you, even though it has nothing really to do with the book, I must tell you other stories, or a few, maybe one or two, that I was pleased that John Hope, who I just call John, lived long enough for us to become friends. He was 90-something when he died, and that I lived long enough that we could become friends, because when I was a student and he was already a professor and writing stuff and I first met him, I was, of course, in awe of the great professor. And to him, I was just another little, student running around. And then for years, he thought that I was just some kind of radical, because at that phase in his career, which he confesses to in his autobiography, he thought that just by punching all the right tickets, white scholars would accept him as equal to them and not just another Negro. And so he was out punching all these tickets, and therefore, when they would criticize us, he would criticize us too, and say, oh, well, they do go a bit far, you know, or something like that. And then he finally, about the time of the Jefferson lecture, and he had been ill before that, because of something that happened to him at Duke and some other stuff, he realized, as he put in the autobiography, that I was just another Negro, that Malcolm was right. And after that, he began to read our stuff and to discuss it with us. And he and I became friends. And we were such friends that we would talk on the phone all the time for years. And John Hope liked to cook. So I remember one night I was sitting down in my study writing something, and I was reading a magazine, and the magazine said, "The late John Hope Franklin." I said, damn, did John Hope die? And I didn't know it. So I called him on the phone. I said, John. He answered the phone. I said, John, are you dead? He said, are you a fool? What are you talking about? So he wrote a note to that magazine saying, you know, reports of my demise are greatly exaggerated, and I'm still here. The thing that Joe read from the book, I was much surprised because I was at home. It was on Christmas, and I didn't know the post office delivered things on Christmas Day. Not UPS, but the regular post office they used to. And I answered the doorbell at my house, and I went to the door, and this guy gave me this book. And I opened the package, and there was this book from John Hope. And it said, from John, and it said what Joe said. He gave it to me as a gift on that day. So we got to be good friends, and I'm glad that we did, and he came to appreciate us, and he also came to appreciate how much he had missed in the earlier stuff that he had done, which served a great purpose at the time. Now, let me talk about, since I've been here, before I came up here, you dragged me over to the tree that was planted, what year was it?
1984.
1984 by the black students across the cut, as it's called. And I walked in the grass across because, hey, I like to walk in grass, in the sun over there. And we went over there in the hot sun and with some students took pictures to commemorate that as part of the struggle here. And I'm always happy to do something like that wherever I go. It was great fun, and I thought it was important to do. Now, as I want to thank Joe for having me and the center for having me here, and all the other people who've been thanked for all the things that they've done to make this center possible, and to talk about this book. And I have to tell you that first, I'll tell you why I wrote the book. I wrote the book, History Teaches Us to Resist, because I was scheduled to go speak at various places after the election in 2016 already. And one place I went first was to a women's conference in Massachusetts, where the heads of all of the women's rights agencies across the state were having their annual conference. And they had planned a big celebration of Hillary's election. And all these people came. It was about 1,000 people at this thing that I went to speak. And when I got there the night before, a woman who was running it said to me, you have to go to this dinner with us, and it's going to be not just you and me and a couple of people, like I said before, but there are the heads of each organization. They want to come because they want to tell you something. So I went. And they proceeded to tell me, one by one, how they felt. We were there for hours and hours and hours, and people cried. People told me stories about their kids watching the election on TV and how they felt, and there was really mourning that went on and on and on and on for hours. And finally, they wanted me to answer each one of them and tell them what they should do. And I said, well, what you really ought to do is what my mother used to always say to us when we were complaining about something. She'd say, well, get up off your do-nothing stool and go do something about it. That's what she'd always say. So I said, that's what you ought to figure out, what you're going to do about it. And so then I went on to other events of that type. And by the time I got back, and it was time to go teach class, I was drained. And my editor, one of my editors, called me, and she said, "You need to write a book." I said, "Why?" I just published a book last year, and I'm exhausted, and I don't feel like, and what's the idea? And she said, "You know what people should do. Well, you have some ideas about things they should do, and everybody has a duty to do whatever they can to shed some light on this circumstance we have to be in. So I want you to write this book." And I said, "No." And then I went to everybody I talked to from various meetings and receptions and even friends of mine sitting at long dinners, and bored the hell out of them saying, "Well, do you guys think I should write this book?" And everybody thought I should write it. And they said, "Not only are you a scholar, and not only will you do the research, but you had the experience. And there must be something you can tell us." And I said, "Well, historians do not believe," the historian part of me, not the lawyer part, "that you can learn anything from history, really. Because, and I don't want to hold myself out as saying that people are going to learn all this stuff from history about what they should do, but it is indeed true that there are certain human characteristics that have existed over time. And so there are certain things that people do that have been done before and so on. So maybe I have something of, I don't know." But by the end of it, I told Gayatri that I would do it. So I decided to do the book. And at first, the first chapter was easy. And I'm pleased, since I published the book, that people have in fact been doing something. You've noticed. There are a lot of things people have been doing in their own way. And some victories have been won. You know, stopping the repeal of Obamacare. I went to some of the forums that people had in various places. But there have been some losses too. The tilt of the tax cuts, the way it turned out. Part of it, the tax cut thing, is good, but the rest of it is, well. The immigration and refugee crisis, which has caused people to conflate the two. In public parlance, when you listen, people talk about refugees and immigrants like they're the same thing, which they're not, which is a problem. There have been losses in the court. There have been losses of appointments because Trump folks are doing what Reagan did, which is to pack the courts with their own people. And the Kavanaugh fight has almost been lost. I can't decide whether Dianne Feinstein, who I have always admired and like, whether she, in fact, just in desperation, decided to do something since they weren't winning, or what this is all about, and I haven't asked anybody. But it looks like he's going to get confirmed. No one has done anything much about the resistant inequality in our country, which still exists, and which is part of what led to Trump being elected. The various appointees and all the different departments and all the bad things they do that we can read about and hear about, whether it's EPA or the Education Department with Ms. DeVos or any of these places. So all of these, the environment, the economy, civil rights, the Civil Rights Division. And sometimes I think it's because lessons from the past are lost. And it is true, maybe, that you do need to remember a little bit about what happened in the past. There's Kaepernick and the protests. I love that. Black Lives Matter, the marches and protests. There's all kinds of things, ferment, the gun control, the kids and what they're doing. And they have found a way to do different things to sort of keep the thing going. And all of that is very interesting. Now, what's in this book? In the first chapter, I decided to take on the task of talking about a president who appeared to be friendly. Because I have discovered in my time in the nonprofit sector doing protests and stuff, that we always have a temptation to think that certain people, politicians, are going to be friendly. You know, oh, we don't have to worry now that X is the president, or Y is the governor, or whatever it is, and they'll just do whatever, you know, and that's not true. And so FDR, you know, is usually regarded as the friendly president. And A. Philip Randolph thought he was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Thought at first that he believed everything he told him, that he was the friendly president. And what Randolph learned was that you had to put pressure on him to get him to do something, that you actually had to, and that you couldn't believe everything that he told you. And so what they did in that March on Washington movement, it was the first time that a national policy had been changed by a protest movement that really didn't lead to a march in Washington. There had been marches before, whether it was the bonus marches or veteran. You can look at the women's marches for suffrage and a lot of stuff. So you can look at all that. But they didn't actually have a march. They threatened to have a march. And Eleanor Roosevelt believed them because people had organized. You could go out on the ground. She sent people out to find out, are they really organizing a march? And they came back and said, yeah, they rented buses. They got people lined up to come. They've organized the women of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in every town. They have lined up places for people to sleep. They've got the whole thing going. They got food, stuff, all they're ready to come. And then they believed that they really were going to do it. And Roosevelt didn't want them to come, which is why he ended up issuing the executive order saying that blacks could work in the defense industry during World War II, which is where a lot of the jobs were. There are some lessons to be learned from that. What they did about women. Women did a lot of the work. Does that surprise you? Organizing it, being there, doing everything that had to be done. But the women organizers who were on staff didn't get paid as much as the men. They hardly got paid anything. And they had to beg and plead for everything. And the guys just, mistreated them terribly. They also learned things for the next march, the '63 march. They already knew, you got to organize the buses, you got to do this, you get in touch with this woman and this family and that church and all the rest of it, and they just took the playbook that they had used before. So even whether you win or lose, you learn something. That's really the thing to say there. And he also figured out something else. He had other stuff on the agenda, not just defense industry. He wanted to get the military desegregated. And there were other items on the list, but they gave those up to get that. And then after that, then they started working on the next part of the agenda. So that's one of the chapters. The next one was the hardest one to write, and that was the one on the anti-Vietnam War protests. And that was the most painful one to write because I was in the anti-war movement when I was a student at Michigan. And I, in the summer of 1967, went to Vietnam as a war correspondent. And as you can imagine, it was a rather bloody, tragic time. And so it was a painful chapter to write when I first started writing it. I said, I don't know if I can really, write this. And then I sent notes off to some of the people I know who are professors now at various places, who were in the anti-war movement with us at Michigan. And we went back and forth, and I was able to write it. And once I started writing it and getting it going, I was able to do it. The story of how I became a war correspondent has to do with my inveterate curiosity, which started the day I could first talk, which the first word my mother said, I said, was why. And I've been saying why ever since. In fact, what happened was we had sit-ins and teach-ins, and the Students with Democratic Society started in Michigan. All that happened during my time. And I was very much involved, but I decided I wanted to go see what it was like for myself. And then I wrote to the Defense Department and said, okay, how do I go over there and see what's going on? And they wrote back and said, you can't. They said the only people who can go are reporters and the military, and you're not a reporter and you're not the military. So I wrote again and said, well, how do you get to be a reporter? And they said, well, if you have 300,000 subscribers to the media you work for, the paper, they said, you work for, we will give you credentials as a war correspondent, and then you'll be able to go. But you have to pay your own way and all that. But you need 300,000 subscribers. So I went to the Michigan Daily newspaper on campus and said, how many subscribers do you have? And they told me. And I said, would you like to have a war correspondent? They said, yeah, who? I said, me. They said, oh, okay. And so they gave me a letter. And then I went to all the little towns around in Michigan to the papers and said, would you like the same thing? Would you like to have a war correspondent? And everybody said, yeah, that'd be nice. We don't have any money to pay you, but cool. And so I got letters from all these people. And I sent them to the Defense Department. And they sent me my credentials, which I still have. And they sent me a note and said, when you get there, go down on to Rex Hotel and pick up all your gear. And you can go out in the field anywhere you want to. Anywhere you can get somebody to take you. They didn't embed people then. They talk about embedding now. We didn't do that. But you have to get there back. And when you're out in the field, you can eat and sleep with the officers. When you're in Saigon, it's up to you, baby. They didn't say baby, but. And so I didn't have any money. So I went around to the same papers and collected money to buy a ticket. So I'd have, and the Daily, and got money from students and bought a plane ticket, round trip. And I went off to Vietnam. And when I was on the plane, I met lots of reporters who were real reporters. And they said, where are you going and who do you work for? And I told them my story, and they just died laughing. And they told me stuff about what reporters do. And I had a little notebook to write in, and I still have it. It's at my house, all covered with dirt and blood. Anyway, I went there, and on the plane from Bangkok to Saigon, a young guy got on, sat down next to me, and we'd stuck up a conversation. He worked for USAID, United States AID, a foreign service. He said, where are you staying when you're in Saigon? I said, I don't know, on the street, I guess. He said, well, come stay at the house with us. There are 4 of us, and they let us stay there. And we even have people to wash clothes for them, to cook, and when you're in town, you can come go home with me, and you can stay with. So he took me home with him. So whenever I was in Saigon, I brought back my laundry and everything, and I went over there. But then I went down and got my gear, which was combat gear, and they assigned a sergeant to me, an older fellow, who they said was to protect me from getting killed. Because an American named Dickie Chappelle, who was a Life magazine photographer, Pulitzer Prize winner, had stepped on a landmine and had gotten killed. And she was the only American that they had track of there. And so they didn't want me killed. So they sent this guy, and he was supposed to follow me everywhere I went, and he couldn't keep up with me. I would just go off and leave him. And so from that day on, we went out in the field, and you hitch a ride. You go out to the airfield, and you say, where are you guys going? And they tell you, and you say, can I hitch a ride with you? Come on, and you go. You go out in the field with the soldiers on one of the operations out in the field. Or you just go, I was I was everywhere in Vietnam, from down at the bottom with the Navy and the Koreans, all the way up to the DMZ with the Marines, the 3rd Battalion, 4th Marine Regiment at a place called Cantien, which was death in a very small place. But, and so whenever I met somebody who came from one of these places where I was supposed to be the war correspondent, I would do hometown news for them and send it back. Some of them obviously got killed. But I felt like I knew one of the stories I tell in the book is about this young black soldier. A lot of the poor white and black soldiers didn't know what they were there for. And they would tell me. I'd interview them, and I would write down whatever they told me. And I would send a telex every week back with my story, and it would start out, today I'm in wherever I am, and we're not winning the war. That's what I just did all the time. And this young guy said to me, he said, you write, and I can't tell you his name. He said, you write down what I say. That's wonderful. He said, people come by here all the time and they interview all of us and they never write down what we say. He said, and when I'm gone, nobody's going to remember me because they never write down what we say. But you write it down. He said, that's wonderful. That's great. You write it down. I said, well, I write it down because I'm not a real reporter and I don't know what I'm doing. And so, but these other guys know what they're doing, so don't worry. People will remember you. You will be remembered. But the thing about Vietnam on the policy side is for years, the other reason why it was painful, I thought we had failed because the war was not over even after we got Johnson to not run again, and Nixon carried it on for years and lots of people got killed. And I always saw it in my mind as one of the great failures that the anti-war movement, and of course it caused the weathermen to go out and engage in violence, and a lot of stuff happened. And it was only when I started to research it again that I found out what everybody else probably knew, that Nixon had monkey-wrenched the peace process, and that the North Vietnamese were willing to come to the peace table, as we all thought, but that he screwed it up deliberately so he could win the election, which, was terrible because so many more people died. And once I knew that, it was easier to write it toward the end. The other one is, and I learned a lot of lessons from that, which I talk about in the book. The other one is Reagan. I go from there to Reagan. Reagan, on the domestic side, he did a lot of the things that we've seen Trump do, but nobody remembers, you see. Our attention span and our memories are very short. He fired me from the Civil Rights Commission, which I had been appointed to by Jimmy Carter, because I criticized his policies. He told a reporter that I served at his pleasure, but I wasn't giving him very much pleasure. That's what he told him. But I sued him in federal district court. The story is in the book, and I won. Because the commission is supposed to be independent. He packed the courts, as I said. He also did awful things, like on the AIDS crisis, which was really horrific at that time. He would not even say the word until Rock Hudson died. Some of you nodding your heads, so you know that. On the environment, he kept talking about, how casting aspersions on people who cared about forests and trees and things like that. He was a terrible guy. And ACT UP on the AIDS thing, they really went after him. They were great in everything that they did on making sure that the medication was available and other stuff. They had on drugs, Just Say No, that thing with, Nancy, I guess the name is. So they were, and in the civil rights, in the Justice Department, we talk all the time about the Justice Department now, and Sessions. In the Justice Department, a whole bunch of attorneys, civil rights attorneys, who were career attorneys, who didn't have another job, quit their jobs and walked out of the Justice Department because they wouldn't let them enforce the civil rights laws. Told them they couldn't enforce them anymore. So they quit. They didn't have any jobs. They were out on the street. They all just walked out of the place together. And the guy who he put in charge of the Civil Rights Division, every time they would win a case from their reactionary court, he would announce to the press that, yeah, another slam dunk for the administration, as in great glee that we all had to put up with. The EPA, we don't remember, but Doonesbury used to write cartoons. You know who Doonesbury? You don't know who Doonesbury. Cartoons about the people in EPA jumping out the window because they couldn't enforce the law, and they had that awful woman over there who was Gorsuch's mother, what was her name, Ann Borford Gorsuch or something, who was held in contempt of Congress. All of that happened, and you had the guy who ran agriculture who said that all black people needed was what? Loose shoes and what is it? Something else. He made cast aspersions. And he had some advisory committee, and he said, well, I had a cripple, a Negro, and he called all these people names who were on there in public. All this stuff happened while he was there. And then we had the Free South Africa movement, which I talk about there, which we all organized in collusion's a good word in this case, with the people in South Africa, with the trade unions and the anti-apartheid movement. We took our direction from them in terms of what they wanted us to do. And a little group of us organized it. And for a year and a half, we had protests every single day during the week where either a lot of people got arrested or celebrities got arrested. We found out that with the media, if you had a lot of people, huge numbers of people, they would cover you. If you had celebrities, you didn't need a whole lot of people. If you got the heavyweight champion, you got the most famous movie star, or you got this person or that person, and after we went the night of Thanksgiving that year and got arrested and started the thing, and we picked that night because it was when everybody's at home and the TV needs to fill up the cable with something, and it was all over the world. It became an international movement, and there were chapters everywhere, including here, and there are some people here who were in some of the chapters who, in fact, engaged in activities. And it wasn't just at the South African Embassy, it was all over. We closed down Shell Oral's offices in Washington, took them over, closed them down. We closed down the Krugerrand dealers because they were selling Krugerrands to make money, the South African government. So we took over the building at the largest money exchange and closed it down. And educated people about it. All of that's in the book. And Reagan was opposed. The question is, how do you get this done when the president is totally opposed to what you're doing? And in fact, how can you get a bipartisan group of people, Republicans like Nancy Kassebaum and Richard Lugar and others, to join with Democrats to support this movement? Is it because it's somewhere else? Or is it because we analogized it to segregation in the United States and Jim Crow? What is the reason? And the tactics that we used and the strategies that we used to keep the movement going and to keep people paying attention so that people didn't lose interest and to get sanctions passed in the Congress of the United States and the lessons learned. After that, it's about Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was, I call him the adaptable president. I'd known Bill Clinton since I ran education in the federal government in the Carter administration, and used to see him when I'd pass by through Arkansas or he came through. Like all politicians, they write you little notes all the time. That's just politicking. So I knew him. And Bill Clinton is, as most of you know, a wonderful, nice guy. He's a great guy to sit around and talk to. He knows how to focus on people. He learned that from being at the White House when Kennedy was president, and he was at that thing they have for high school students that they come to the White House. And he was looking, there's a picture, he's looking at Kennedy with such adoration, and Kennedy is looking at somebody else. That's why Bill Clinton always looks directly at people. He'll stand there and look at you all day long, because that's embedded in his memory. But Bill Clinton was not willing to do the things that he should have done, some of them. He had anti-globalization protests when he was there. There was a whole thing around welfare reform. There was racial profiling, driving while black. Remember that? Now it's living while black, being in your own apartment while black, going to the swimming pool while, whatever, while black, just being black, whatever. Out in public, being black. And we tried hard to get him to do something. But he was trying to make sure that he stayed in the middle on all of these issues. And people put pressure on him on the whole globalization thing, which was the first one to really use social media to organize. But on all the other issues, he got a blank check, really. He got away with murder. People on NAFTA, okay, the unions kept telling him, you are going to screw workers who won't have jobs, and so what is it you're going to do for them? And he was just saying to all of us, you should tell them that we're going to train them, you know. And we said, train them for what? Just tell them you're going to train them, you know, train them. And people, you know, they saw through, if you train us and there's nothing to train us for, then what are we supposed to do? And I think that a lot of, coming back to Trump, what set the table for somebody like Trump was never dealing with any of these things. So I talk about that as the adaptable president. Then I talk about George Herbert Walker Bush, who was, George Herbert Walker Bush, who's still around, I guess. He was a good preppy, as we would have said at Penn. He acted like a good prep school guy, you know, want to be polite all the time, all that, but did some nefarious things but was bothered when he did nefarious things, like lying about Clarence Thomas and saying he looked all over the country and the best guy he could find was Clarence Thomas. I thought, wow, where'd you get that whopper from? And I forgot the Bork fight with, Robert Bork, that whole fight. But anyway, and I will never forget the Rodney King thing when those police officers out there were acquitted, and he announced to the press that he was going to appeal the acquittal. And somebody said, well, you can't have them prosecuted again. And somebody said, you can't do that. And he said, oh, well, when did that happen? You know, he was that kind of guy. But the thing in his administration, which is most important, that I spent a lot of time on, is the Americans with Disabilities Act. The people who organized the movement to get the Americans with Disabilities Act, they were one of the 3 best movements that existed. The whole ACT UP campaign was one of them. Free South Africa was another. Hello was another. And the Americans with Disabilities, and the way they organized all across the country in places, and they were persistent. They started organizing when I was in the Carter administration, when they took over the building downstairs in HEW where we had our headquarters, and the branch offices at the same time, and scared the hell out of the secretary, Joe Califano, and even went to his house. And he was scared of all these disabled people, called all us together. What am I going to do about all these disabled people? You know, they're in wheelchairs and they're whatever. What am I going to do with these people? You know, I said, Joe, why should you be scared of these people? They're not going to bother you. They come in here to protest because you won't sign the regs implementing Section 504, which was supposed to give them less discrimination in transportation. But they also, with ADA, they knew how to switch tactics and what to do, and they stayed on message. And that at the end, when it looked like the thing wasn't going to pass, when that little girl fell out of her wheelchair on the bottom steps of the Capitol, she had cerebral palsy or something, and she deliberately fell out of the chair and then climbed up every single step of the Capitol. It was mesmerizing national media. They went in and voted to pass it. I mean, what else were you going to do? And so the ADA movement was really an example of how you really do things. The other thing I point out, with George W. Bush, there were the protests about Iraq, but they got started too late. They got started too late, and they were not broadly conceived, and they weren't persistent enough. But mainly they got started. They didn't start until Colin Powell gave that thing about the weapons of mass destruction. Should have started way before that, and should have been more persistent, and maybe they would have worked. Katrina, we forget Katrina. When you hear people talking about hurricanes now and flooding, people forget all those people who died and all the repercussions of the flooding that they died from. And we're having flooding now in those places down in the Carolinas. You cannot have missed it because it's all over the TV and everything else. Have any of you ever been in a hurricane? A few of you have. Have any of you ever been in? Yes. Have any of you ever been in severe flooding after a hurricane? Yes. Well, I've been in a couple of hurricanes and severe flooding afterwards. And the most eerie thing about it, somebody was saying, is once the hurricane starts to pass your place, the whole sky clears. Remember that? It clears because all the water is gone, and the beauty of it, just the sky and everything, with all the disaster around you and all that you see, it's like you see the sky and you think, how can the sky be so beautiful when everything is in total disarray? What does this mean? Anyway, I thought about that today when I was looking at it. But anyway, here's the lessons that I learned from all this. Technology changes, and therefore the way you organize and what you can organize with changes, okay? We used to, in the old days, use a mimeograph machine and get ink all over our fingers and go and put out flyers and put things on trees, and we would call up people on the phone or something, do something, or use snail mail. Now, of course, you use social media to organize. It's good on the one hand because, in fact, you can do it fast. but you can also be kept under surveillance. And also, people misplace social media for doing something. All of my friends who are in the media, especially the TV types, tell me that we can't cover people unless they do something. Now, if you get so many people to sign up online on social media for a cause, we might give you one little report saying you got 1 million, whatever. But we're not going to follow you unless you do something. You have to show up and do something. And a lot of people forget that. The other thing is that I am more concerned about policy, which is what the book is not about trying to get personalities elected or getting this one or that one or promoting that one. Although in every movement, and I talk about that, there are always people who are in it to promote themselves. Black Lives Matter had that problem for a while. They still do. Other organizations all do that. People who are not part of the conception of what the movement is about, but they come in and figure out how to get some media, and they come up and say, I'm the spokesperson for the whatever. They do something, and then the whole thing is hijacked, and it goes off in some direction. The people who had that Wall Street protest tried to not have a leader so that the press wouldn't do that. And I spent a lot of time talking to those people behind the scenes. But the fact that they didn't have anybody as the spokesperson meant that a lot of the media couldn't deal with what they were doing. They said, what are you doing? You know, what is the vision? In Free South Africa, what we did is we had a little tight group that ran everything and met every morning at my house for a year and a half to plan what we were going to do, and kept it there until we were ready to disclose it, so that people couldn't hijack what was going on, and so that we knew what was going on. We got some people who criticized us and said, you people are too secretive. Well, okay, but it worked. So in fact, what you have to do is you have to also be persistent. People give up too easily. They do something and then they say, all right, I just did it. It's not a one-off. It's never a one-off. If you're going to succeed, you have to be in it, and you have to focus on policy. One of my frustrations right now about all the stuff that's going on is there's too much talk about particular people promoting this person or attacking that person or doing whatever. I'm interested in policy. I'm not interested in. I worry that if the Democrats take over the House, which they should, there's no reason why they shouldn't, and even if they took over the Senate, that there's very little talk about what the policies will be. There's all the talk about voter suppression, so therefore you should vote, blah, 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 da, 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 da. But when I ask, what are you going to do? Because in fact, the reason why, again, we have Trump is because successive people who got in office didn't do anything, or didn't even try, and even if you can't, you can try, about the problems that persist. And there was no movement to change the policies. The only movement that focused directly that I can think of, aside from the age stuff that I just talked about in ADA, the pro-choice marches that took place. Marches usually don't change policy. Those changed policy because they happened in waves, successive ones, right after another, and because they passed right by the Supreme Court building, and the judges looked out the window and saw them. And Scalia said that he didn't pay it in the Casey case from Pennsylvania. He said, we didn't pay any attention to marches. You don't pay attention to those marches. And so my students, who are very prescient, said, if they don't pay attention, then how did he know they were marching? He's lying. He did see them marching. The fact that it happened in waves and waves and waves. Persistence is the greatest thing. So all I am saying is that it is possible to win, no matter how difficult the challenge. And you can't say, if we can get Free South Africa to win when Reagan is president, when he vetoed the bill and we had to pass it over his veto and keep on protesting, if ADA could pass, despite the opposition, if any of these things could happen, then you can always make social change, no matter how perilous the times. Thank you very much.